After I got married to my wife, we needed to get extra shifts in order to pay for the debt from the wedding. Since childhood, she had a dream of a big wedding, but she ended up with a bride instead of a husband. Her parents refused to pay a dime towards the wedding, let alone attend. We still had a big party and a great day, but by paying for the party made us push our honeymoon off for 6 months. We couldn't do anything big, so we found a nice bed and breakfast to visit in the countryside. 4 days off work was something we could afford after all that overtime. Packing up the car, we got ready to head out early in the day, only to get stuck behind the worst traffic in history. We couldn't go anywhere for 2 hours. At least we found some good local radio stations. After we finally got on the highway, more bad luck struck. Our back tyre burst, causing us to pull over. This honeymoon trip felt cursed. Fixing it took a while, but I finally got it done. I was thankful that I remembered to put down the emergency kit and spare on the trunk before the trip. By the time we got going again, we both felt starving and dropped by the first rest stop for something to eat. I wanted us to have been able to get to the town early enough for some sightseeing before the 4 p.m. check-in time. We weren't going to make it. After a call to the owners, they agreed to let us check in at any time that night. Susan was glad they were so understanding and relaxed a little after such a terrible day. With my bad eyesight, I didn't want to drive in the dark, so my wife took over for me. We kept going over just how long the route would take and decided to use a shortcut. The plan had been to take our time in the day and drive through some scenic small towns. Now that the trip had changed to being mostly at night, the quicker way seemed better. Dinner finished and a plan set. We got ready for the night drive, wondering what else could go wrong. As we drove further and further away from home, the songs on the radio changed. It started to drift into mostly country songs in nearly all counties. Better stations would soon turn to static, then fizz out. The sun had already set, leaving us driving down a dark and empty highway. Not even the mood out to guide our way. The only light besides our headlights was a bright display screen in the middle of the dashboard, showing us what country channel the radio got stuck on. I honestly thought having a screen was a hazard, but at least slightly better than using a cell phone. Trees on both sides flew past. Aside from some trucks on occasion, no other cars were on the road. I always hated long, dark highway drives, but at least I wasn't alone this time. Susan started to pass the time by talking about all the different kinds of pastries she wanted to try on our trip. The place Susan booked advertised an abundance of bakeries in the area, and that was the main reason we decided on the small bed and breakfast so far away. It'd be nice to get away, but to also gain a few pounds while we did so. A while into our trip, I caught some movement out of the corner of my eye. I assumed it was dust on my glasses, so I raised my hand to brush them off. When I fully saw what the movement was, I froze and my heart skipped a beat. Sneaking across the dashboard, illuminated by the light of our useless radio screen, was a pale shape. A ghostly spider, slowly taking small steps towards my poor, unsuspecting wife. She didn't like them, but I felt scared to death by them. I know they're good for eating even the worst bugs, but I just can't stand the sight of one. I held back screeching, knowing that might cause an accident from such a sudden and loud noise. As the spider moved closer to the driver's side, I let out a small whine. "Hey, what is it?" Susan asked worryingly. I shook my head, pointing at the thing, unable to speak. I was so scared, my hand trembled and skin prickled every time the spider took a step. My wife finally saw what I was looking at. She let out a sigh, knowing we needed to deal with this, but she didn't want to pull over. With some difficulty, she slipped off a sandal while still driving to take care of the threat. I almost felt sorry for the thing when she crushed it and took care of the body with some napkins I handed to her. She even tossed the corpse out the window for my peace of mind. The damn spider was so big, I heard the crunch. I no longer wanted to talk about food. "I'm so glad I married you," I said with a long sigh, but still feeling stressed. "You eat my peppers, so we're even," she joked. We made a good pair. I would gladly eat every pepper in the world if it meant she would keep any spiders from getting near me. I hoped that would be the most amount of excitement that happened during the drive. I kept glancing between the window and the dashboard, fearing I would see another stowaway creep across my sight. We drove on to start seeing a fog hanging at strange angles outside, the headlights showing a pale whiteness through the trees. The rest of the world was dark beyond what our lights could reach. Even the sky appeared pitch black. No light pollution this far out and in the middle of nowhere. I couldn't even see any stars because of the clouds. Seeing the spider made my nerves tense too much to sleep. My mind is playing tricks on me, making my arms itch from phantom spiders crawling over them. I really hated seeing those 8-legged bastards, but hadn't reacted this badly to one in a while. "This fog is weird," Susan commented, breaking the silence. "What do you mean?" I started to ask, until I finally noticed what she already did. The fog wasn't moving. I'd seen heavy, still fog before, and this wasn't it. It looked far too solid. I frantically started to look at the patches of white overtaking the trees and edges of the road, desperate to figure out what it was. I almost asked for us to pull over to get a better look, and know now that would have been a mistake. A patch of the odd white fog stretched across the road from tree to tree, and Susan kept going, thinking it was too high up for our car to touch it. The roof snagged a part of the white threads, and to my utter horror, I figured out it wasn't fog straight away. I let out a scream as hundreds of spiders filled from the white threads and down the windshield. Susan screamed and nearly went off the road. She collected herself at the last second and started to use the wipers to knock the abominations loose. Countless of the pale white spiders clung to the side mirror and to the windows with threads they somehow attached. Their small bodies flew through the wind until they were finally taken away. I was losing it at that moment. I started shoving napkins in the AC vents, thinking the spiders could get inside that way. My fear levels were so high, I was nearly seeing white, and my entire body shook. I'm positive I started screaming and babbling nonsense, but wasn't in the right state of mind to remember any of it. My wife also freaked out, but decided at that moment she was going to gun it. Her foot was heavy on the gas to get us the hell out of there. We didn't know what was happening, and what caused this all didn't matter. We just needed to get away from it all. In seconds, the heavy patches of spider threads became unavoidable. She tried to hit the smaller patches, causing so many spider bodies to be crushed on the windshield, it was almost impossible to see at times. I was dry heaving, knees to my chest and arms so itchy I wanted to die. The road became so slick with the spider gore, Sudden had a hard time driving in a straight line. At least we were the only ones on the road, or else we would have caused an accident. I heard a voice repeating how this just couldn't be happening. I was shocked to find out it was my own. I didn't sound like myself. Susan's face was pale and sweaty. She needed to deal with trying to stay on the road and with a panicking wife at the same time. There were so many of those ghostly pale spiders that I could hear them being crushed in a mass as we drove over the bundles of threads. The car made an awful noise as it struggled to keep speed with the sticky spider web coating it. Was this a punishment for killing every spider I came across in the past? I prayed that if we were spared, I would usher them outside no matter how much they frightened me. Soon, the headlights were showing pure white and barely any signs of the road in front. We couldn't stop. If we stopped, those things could get inside the car. How I didn't see any crawling across inside yet was a miracle. Susan started swearing, and rightfully so. I didn't want to die because of spiders. Give me any kind of death but that. I also didn't want anything happening to my perfect wife I finally found after an entire life of looking. The car made grinding sounds, begging us to let it stop, but we pushed on. I saw a large shape in the mass of the threads, too late to warn her. The front end of the car clipped something tall and thin, like a young tree. It smashed the right headlight, and somehow, we kept driving. I heard a terrible rumbling noise coming from whatever we just hit. It was a sound I've never heard before, and never wanted to hear again. It sounded like a pure, dark rage. I thought it would follow us, and I reached out to grip Susan's shoulder, thinking this would be our last moments together. We both let out a gasp as our struggling car burst through the final patch of threads covering the road and onto a perfectly normal, dark highway. My wife didn't stop to investigate what we just went through. The car couldn't go to the speed limit, but as long as we were moving, it was fine. As much as I wanted to drive all night, the toll of it all finally came down in full force. I started having the worst panic attack of my life. At first, I honestly thought it was a heart attack. My wonderful wife kept a cool head and found a motel only a few minutes away. She pulled in, careful not to let me see the webs still clinging to the car, and got us a room for the night. She ushered me into the small bathroom. While she dealt with everything, I cried in the shower, trying to wash off imaginary spiders, until she had to gently get me out of the running water. I was so out of it, I didn't even notice she called the cops until I got dressed. The flashing lights sitting just outside our room woke up the only other person at the motel. She didn't want the cops to show up, but after telling her story to the emergency operator, they didn't know who else to send. Our car was proof of what we saw. The motel staff and the guest found it all pretty interesting, and no one wanted to get near the spider gut-soaked car. The cops tried going down the way we came from. They reported finding some spider nests and a whole lot of crushed bodies on the road, but nothing like how we described it. They kept looking at our car, trying to understand it all. Our honeymoon could wait. The entire experience put too much of a sour taste on the trip following through with it. We only lost the deposit on the bed and breakfast room and the cost of a car rental. We called a family friend to pick our car up and then get it cleaned up and brought back. There was no way we were going to drive that thing home. In fact, I wanted to sell the damn thing as soon as possible. Let's do something less terrifying for our honeymoon. It was the first thing she'd said on our way back home in a rented car and running on no sleep. I thought through the options and rejected ideas we had before settling on the bed and breakfast. How about that lame haunted Navy ship sleepover in October we didn't want to wait for, I suggested. We both looked at each other and silently agreed that ghosts were way less terrifying than a horde of spiders. One night, I was heading home from a late night at work. My car was still in the shop, so I took the bus home. I was thankfully able to get the last bus. Besides the bus driver, I was the only one on it. My week of taking overtime shifts finally caught up on me, and I started to drift off to sleep, unable to help myself. I promised I would only let my eyes rest until the next stop. Within seconds, I was completely asleep. A small ding above my head caused me to jerk awake. I thought it was the sound of the bus. I looked around in a daze, trying to find where I was. I should have been on the bus. Light flooded in through small windows on the sides, and a smell of rot filled my nose. I slightly gagged as my mind slowly adjusted to the place. Instead of sitting on the last bus on the way home, I was sitting in an aisle seat on a plane. A plane? I haven't been on a plane in my entire life. I owned a passport, but that didn't explain how I woke up on a plane. I didn't often dream, and this was far too real. In silent, frantic fear, I turned my head to ask the person sitting next to me what the hell was going on when my words died in my throat. The man next to me was clearly dead. My heart was beating out of my chest. Nothing made any sense. I was too scared to move. I could only look past the man and to the woman sitting next to the window, who was also looking as pale as the grave. My mind stopped working at that moment. When a pair of flight attendants walked over to the front of the aisle, I didn't notice them until they started to speak and go over the safety measures every flight has. A chipper voice finally made my head turn to watch their routine. "Hello, our darling dead ones. We'll be your flight attendants for this flight. Since this plane has a 0 chance of crashing, this talk may be a bit different than most. But let us introduce ourselves first, because you'll be spending a lot of time with us. My name is Nettie, and this wonderful lady is..." The taller male flight attendant spoke, and then paused to gesture towards his female partner, with a smile plastered over his face. The girl was wearing the same uniform as him, only with a skirt, and had an exhausted look on her face. "Boaty," she said, as if she could care less. Still full of enthusiasm, the man kept speaking. "We'll do our best to make you all comfortable on this flight. Just ask. We've modelled this plane to be like the ones you've been on while you were alive. Very comforting, right? We even have those masks that drop down in case of emergencies, but you'll never need to use them. You're all not breathing, but we do let the masks drop for fun," Nettie said, his wide smile never fading. This man was made for customer service. Super fun, Boaty added in a monotone voice. We have drinks and those little peanuts for you to look at. All such fun. If you ever need us, please press the button for a little ring-a-ding. Ring-a-ding, Boaty added with a massive sigh. We're here to help with anything. Does anyone have any questions so far? The bright smile was still on his face as he raised his hand as if he were the one asking a question. Nettie waited a few seconds to look over the dead silent group he was addressing. To my horror, some of them were shuffling around stiffly, each with their dead milky eyes and looking slightly decomposed. Myself and the flight attendants were the only ones who looked alive in that plane. I finally shot my hand up for him to notice. With an even brighter smile, he spotted me. Oh, terrific. A question. We've never had one of those, Nettie said in a happy tone. I like your presentation, but what if I'm not dead and shouldn't be here? I asked. The smile almost faded from his face. Some of the dead tried to turn their heads towards me, but soon I forgot I was even there and looked blindly in front of them. Hurrying over, the flight attendant stopped in front of my chair and got low so we could meet eye to eye. His kind face almost made me forget what kind of situation I was in. I stared at him, now able to see clearer. For some reason, I wasn't wearing my contacts. It wasn't a big deal. After a few feet, some things were a bit fuzzy. When I first looked at the pair, I thought something was off about them. With him being so close, I now saw what it was. His hair wasn't hair, but silver feathers coming down from his head. My mouth dropped open at the strange new sight, nearly making me shut down. You poor little thing. You must have had a sudden death and didn't realize, Nettie explained. I nearly fainted. My heart was beating. How was I dead? Did the bus crash in my sleep? What happened, and how did I get here? He slipped a hand to my wrist with a caring expression on his face. We'll just check your pulse to prove... His words were suddenly cut off as his eyes grew wide. His mouth clamped shut, and I heard an old humming coming from him. It took me a few seconds to realize he was muffling his own screams. Yanking me to my feet, the skinny man started to haul me down the aisle. His body moved stiffly as the corpses around us. Why, yes, sir, you may see the washroom. I'll show you where it is. Let's keep walking this way. Nettie's voice was tense while still trying to sound cheerful. The dead eyes of the other passengers watched as I was dragged past them, Nettie narrating our slow trip. Walking, walking, we are still walking. His voice was so stressed, he sounded as if he was slightly singing. When we finally got into the small space where the attendants made the meals, he finally let my wrist go. Boaty followed us and a questioning look came over her face. She didn't understand why Nettie would drag a passenger back there. Her feathers were black and longer than Nettie's. She covered one half of her face with them, giving her a little bit of a goth look. She honestly appeared out of place in a uniform. What got your feathers in all a ruffle? She asked, arms crossed. Instead of using his words, Nettie grabbed my wrist again and her hand. Pressing it against my skin, it took her a long minute to clue into what he was trying to show her. When she did, her eyes grew wide and feathers puffed up. Unable to accept what she was feeling, she pressed her ear to my chest to hear the frantic heartbeat. He's alive? She asked when she finally pulled away. I know. Has this ever happened before? Nettie chimed in, looking between her and myself. Why are you asking me? You've done this job for longer. The entire thing was so strange, I couldn't bring myself to interrupt the conversation. Pausing to think, Nettie nodded. He pulled out a notepad and peeled off a gold sticker to place on his partner's uniform. A gold star observation. This was too weird to be real. I had to be dreaming, or someone was playing a prank on me. To start with, their feathers needed to be fake. Reaching out, I didn't warn Nettie before I ran both hands through his feathers, trying to find where the headpiece or fake feathered wig started. The silver feathers felt softer and warmer than they looked. A panicked chirping sound made me pause, and I finally clued in what was coming from him. I jerked my hands back, realizing that I'd done something really inappropriate to him. His pale face flushed as he tried to get his chirping under control. Boaty gave me a very, not a cool move, dude, look. I'm sorry, I just didn't think the feathers were real, I stammered. Nettie silently waved it off, saying it was all right. He wasn't collected enough to speak yet. Looking him over, I saw some details I had missed before. Their legs were far too skinny for them to be standing upright. Boaty wore white long socks that ended at her ankles, with clawed feet looking as if they should belong to birds supporting her weight. Nettie had the same poking out from his uniform pants. Their hands had fingers that were unusually long and bony. Each of them had pale skin and grey eyes that almost glittered like silver. These two were not human, as hard to accept that was. So, what are you two? I asked slowly. Flight attendants, Nettie answered in a positive voice. No, I mean, you're not human, right? Are you a weird bird hybrid? Did you hatch out of an egg or something? At that moment, I needed to deal with the less weird facts first. After I figured out what these two were, I could move on to how I got there and what was going on. They both looked at each other, showing they can never considered the question before. I don't know, to be honest. We've just always been doing this. Do you think we even have parents? Nettie asked his partner, who just shrugged. Okay, so I wouldn't know what these two are. Then I guess I needed to focus on the next question of why I was on a plane full of dead people, and how. From the looks of it so far, neither of them had that answer. As far as they could tell, anyone who ended up on this plane should be dead. Aside from each other, that is. Is there any way to get me home? I clearly shouldn't be here, I asked, hoping for a good answer. Well, this has never happened to me before, so I wouldn't know. The plane never lands. Because you're alive, I can't really explain the point of this flight or how it works, but it was made to stay in the air. We can't drop you off anywhere. The only thing I can think of is to ask Sorty about this. He's trained all of us and is like a father figure. Guessing to him is going to be difficult, though. Nettie was trying to stay positive as he spoke. My bleak outlook dampened his cheerful personality a little. That was not a good sign. He mentioned getting to Sorty instead of talking to him. How was it possible to go somewhere else and not land? Was this person in a hard-to-reach spot on the plane? I was confused, so Nettie kept talking. We can move between planes. The issue is, we need a feather from the pilot. He's a bit grumpy most days. I can ask him for help. I don't mind, but it might not turn out great. He sounded nervous, but I was clinging to anything I could get. If we needed a feather, we were going to get a damn feather. How hard could it be? I would get on my hands and knees if needed. It sounded like something we could do if this pilot was anything like the pair in front of me. Please, let's go talk to him. I know he'll listen to reason, I begged. The two looked at each other. Boaty shook her head with a nervous look on her face, but Nettie brightened up. He was going to do his best for me. At that moment, I wasn't aware of how far he would go. You're the passenger, and it's our job to make your flight as pleasant as possible. Let's go talk to the pilot. The cockpit is on the other side of first class. Follow me, mister... Actually, I don't know your name. I know all the names of people who should be abroad, but I'm blanking on yours. Cooper, I told him quickly. I disliked my first name, Devon, so I always went by my last name. I thought I heard a happy chirp from Nettie as he nodded and took my wrist again. I didn't need to be guided along, but he did so just in case. Boaty let out a frustrated sigh and followed behind us. As we walked, I remembered how terrifying it was being on a plane full of the dead. Nettie was so pleasant, he eased my fears a little until I had to face rows and rows of dead people, each person showing clear signs of how they died. Each wore what they died instead of what they were buried in. Some were in hospital gowns, others in regular clothing soaked in dried blood. The smell wasn't overpowering, but it was enough, along with the sight of them, to nearly make me get sick. As we walked past each person, they stared at us. It was as if they wanted something, or maybe they could see hints of the life they no longer had. In a few minutes, that felt like forever, we came to a small empty space beyond first class. I didn't know if all plans were set up in the same way. The door to the cockpit was closed tight. Nettie stepped in front, but didn't knock yet. He looked over his shoulder at us, appearing a little nervous. I don't know how he will react to someone alive on the plane, so try breathing as little as possible, he explained. Boaty shoved me in a corner and stood in front trying to hide me from view. Their actions were making me regret ever asking to come over to speak with the pilot, but it was too late. Nettie knocked a few times and politely asked for the pilot to come out to speak with them. Black feathers nearly blocked my sight as I tried to keep my breathing as slow as possible. When the door opened, I nearly choked on my own fear. A massive creature, far too big to fit inside the space, yet somehow did, pushed itself from the open door. The entire body was a black mass made up of feathers. Two large clawed hands hung from the side of the creature as its head reached the ceiling to look down at the nervous Nettie. The face, which was nothing more than two glowing red eyes, locked onto him. "Sir, I hate to bother you in the middle of a flight, but..." His words were literally cut off as both hands shout out to wrap around poor Nettie's throat. He choked out a plea that went unheard by the pilot. The monster forced his thin body to the ground as his frail legs weakly kicked, trying to get free. I gasped and started to push forward, only to find out Boaty was stronger than myself. I needed to do something before Nettie was killed because of my mistake. His attempts at freedom slowed as his face grew pale. Even his feathers looked limp and started to lose colour as the life was being choked out of him. Being as desperate as I was, I looked around trying to find anything to help with. The only thing in the small space was a dusty and forgotten drink cart. Holding my breath, I darted from behind Boaty to grab a can of soda and threw it down the open door and into the first-class aisle. As the monster turned its head towards the noise, I snuck up behind it and took a hold of a feather. It walked forwards, trying to see where the can of soda landed, not even noticing me pulling a feather out as I walked away. The moment it was in first class, Boaty scooped up the limp Nettie, and we all pressed into the wall as much as possible. The pilot came shuffling back in a slow gait, one clawed hand dragging behind a passenger, as it went back inside the cockpit, with the corpse for God knows what. I let out my breath, feeling dizzy from fear. Boaty quickly dragged us along, and I couldn't fight her. She shoved us all inside a small bathroom, locking the door behind us. Nettie was slumped against the wall, his head limp against his chest. I forgot about everything but him for a few moments. There wasn't enough space to lay him down. I looked up at Boaty, panic overtaking any kind of reasoning. "We need to get him outside to do CPR or something," I said, hands shaking. I was checking him over, dreading how pale he was. A dark bruise covered his entire neck from the attack. Boaty didn't look as worried as I was, and I thought she was heartless. "Give him a few minutes. He'll wake up. As long as we're in the sky. We can't die," she said with a shrug. I simply couldn't believe her. Every second we spent not trying to do CPR felt like a second wasted. When I looked back, I could have sworn his face had gained some colour. My chest hurt, and I almost couldn't take any more surprises, even good ones. I watched as Nettie slowly started to recover. His feathers were regaining colour, and his bruise was fading. Finally, he gasped as his eyes flew open. Coughing, he looked around, trying to understand where he was. My hands flew to his cheeks to give him a look over, to see if he was really all right. Sorry, we can ask again," Nettie said, his voice hoarse. After what just happened, he was ready to go through all that again for my sake. I shook my head. Even if I didn't steal a feather, I refused to let him die for my sake. I showed him the large black feather I'd plucked from the pilot while it was distracted. Nettie's face lit up. He was still recovering, but overly excited about the trophy. "You're terrific," he said, in a voice still a little hoarse. I felt my face flush a little. No one had ever complimented me like that before, at least never in such an excited tone. Boaty rolled her eyes at us, saying she was going to do the rounds to make sure the pilot didn't know something was up. When she left, I was crammed on the bathroom floor with Nettie. His long legs needed to be pressed to his chest for us to both fit. "Sorry you were hurt," I said, after the silence became too much. "Don't worry about it. You're the passenger. It's my job to help out. I don't mind." Nettie was far too nice. He should mind. Thinking he was being killed right in front of me was too scary to even think about. I was glad we got the feather, because I never wanted to see something like that again. "What's the plan after you're feeling better?" I asked him, while listening in case the monster came back for his feather. "There's a room we can use at the back of the plane to jump to the one sortie's in. He should know what to do. He's been a flight attendant for the longest, I think," Nettie said, sounding so much better than even a few seconds ago. At least we had some sort of idea what to do next. I gave him a few more minutes until I felt comfortable enough to let him move. I needed to face the crowd of silent dead passengers again. My skin crawled at the sight of them all. Boaty met us and followed along until we reached the back of the plane. It was noisier back there. Nettie stopped to face her, and a worried expression came over her normally displeased face. I'll leave you in charge for a while, he said to her in a chipper tone. I've never handled the entire plane on my own before, she admitted. Nettie assured her that she would do fine until he got back. She even gave her another gold star, and oddly enough, that made her feel better. She gave us a weak wave as Nettie guided me inside the small room to leave the plane. The room wasn't large. It could only fit a handful of people inside if needed. A red bulb overhead made it appear somewhat creepy. All the noise of the plane was shut out the moment the door closed. It was so silent, I could hear my own body functioning. Nettie walked over to the only other thing inside the room. A blank book set into the wall. Using the feather I gave him, he dug the tip into his palm. With his own blood, he wrote the name of the plane he wanted us to go to. An odd sensation came from under my feet, as if I was standing on a waterbed for a few seconds. When it settled, my guide smiled and made his way towards the door. When he opened it, I saw this was not all the same plane we started in. I didn't even understand how this place could be called a plane. A grand ballroom was below us, beyond the balcony. My mouth dropped open a little from all the lush details and glittering chandeliers. Sorty isn't really in charge of a plane. It's more of a blimp, Nettie explained as he headed towards the stairs. I caught up, still trying to take in all the sights. There weren't any of the dead passengers like before. The only person there was, a man walking towards the bottom of the stairway to greet us. His long, thin legs swiftly carried him through the distance. Nettie skipped a few steps to jump into the older man's arms, clearly overjoyed to see him again. He let out happy chirps as his feathers were ruffled. Somehow, the sight gave me a weird feeling. Was I jealous he could pet Nettie's feathers and I couldn't? No, that wasn't it. Nettie, what in Sky's name are you doing here? It's been ages. Look at how tall you've gotten. Nettie must have gotten some of his personality from Sorty. The man's feathers were shorter and grey hue instead of silver, and crow's feet appeared at the corners of his eyes when he smiled. I stopped in front of the pair, praying he had an answer to how I could get home. You brought a passenger? He looks pretty lively, Sorty commented. Yeah, that's the problem, I answered. It took him a bit, but he got what I was trying to say. Sorty was as shocked as Nettie was, seeing I was alive. He checked my pulse a few times, just to be certain. He apologised for getting into my personal space, but couldn't help himself. I haven't seen someone alive in so long. Not since that guy and gal dropped by all those years ago, he said, after he accepted that I was breathing. My heart quickened. So he had seen someone alive before. Coming here was a good call. How did they get back on land, I asked, quickly excited. They didn't. They stayed. All my hopes were crushed at that moment. Nettie pressed on for me. But is there a way to get him back? It's what he wants, and it's our job to make our passengers happy, Nettie chirped, determined in his mission. Sorty paused to think. His long hands scratched at his chin. He asked to see the pilot's feather we arrived with. Looking it over, he didn't appear to like the look of it. Finally, he let us in on his train of thought. There are two choices: stay or jump. Most of these planes do not have a parachute, nor are they at a suitable height for a jump with one. This is one plane you two can go to, but I worry for your safety, Sorty started to explain. I'll be fine, Nettie chipped in, but his mentor shook his head. This feather you have only has enough for 2 trips. You can only go so far, so in order to arrive at the plane you need, you must go to a different plane that is closer. Then jump to the one you want. You're able to reach it if you enter a dark plane, then the one with the parachutes. There are no safer planes close enough for the jumps, and I doubt you'll get another feather. My pilot is grumpier than yours. I suppose you could go back to your plane and try to get more from your pilot. I was trying to make sense of what he was saying. We would need to jump or travel between planes. I didn't want to find out what a dark plane was. Even Nettie looked stressed. Then again, we couldn't try the pilot again either. I got lucky the first time. If I could help it, I didn't want Nettie to get hurt again. But what was more dangerous, a dark plane or the pilot? I didn't know the dark planes were real, Nettie said in a hushed voice. What's a dark plane? I asked, trying to figure out the danger level. Sorty looked me over, as if trying to decide if I was worthy of such a serious secret. My heart couldn't take much more of this. His silver eyes were studying me, and Nettie started to sweat a little from the silent interaction. The older man finally nodded, and I relaxed a little. The passengers on these planes are dead. You can see that. They fly until they're ready to move on. I can't tell you what afterlife, if any, they're headed towards. The flight attendants make the trip more pleasant and guide their way if needed. My plane, or rather blimp, is nearly empty because most have moved on right now. But a dark plane is a result of passengers that simply sit and rot until there's nothing left. Sadly, there always needs to be a flight attendant on the plane. They rot as well. At least they recover after the last passenger is rotted to nothing. Now, that didn't sound good at all. Our options were bleak. I almost considered going back to face the pilot. I didn't want to be on a plane worse than the one I started out on. I looked over to my flight attendant so we could talk about what we wanted to do. On top of all this, I didn't like the idea that my only way out of this was to jump from a plane. I had a fear of heights as it was. People died skydiving, right? How safe was our safest option? Could we get another feather without the pilot attacking you? I asked. Maybe. We would need to wait until the end of the flight for him to be less grumpy. Sometimes that takes 100 years, but I've been a plane empty out sooner than before. My head was swimming. I couldn't last 100 years here. With these options, I understood why others stayed. They simply might not have had a choice. But the math wasn't adding up. How long have planes even been around for? Nettie was acting as if he'd done a few 100-year flights before. Sorty noticed my confusion and spoke up. Time works differently around here. It may be 100 years, but on the ground, only a second or two have passed. We also get passengers from all sorts of time eras. My eyes landed on Nettie, who was smiling and nodding along. Just how old was he? Hundreds? Thousands? And how old did that make Sorty? That was a good point. The pilots tend to listen better after a flight, but your passenger isn't dead and will be by the time the flight ends. I'm afraid you either need to risk the pilot or a dark plane, or stay like everyone else, Sorty said with a shrug. Damn it. This wasn't working out like I'd hoped. I bet the pilot would be even more pissed off the second time around. One of us was going to die, and I couldn't come back like Nettie. The better idea seemed to be the dark plane. After all, I'd been around the dead before, and they hadn't harmed me. Hell, they didn't even look as if they could move. We settled on going to the dark plane. If it became too dangerous, we could jump back to Sorty's blimp and try getting a feather from his pilot. With it all set in stone, Sorty guided us through the massive blimp to another room to leave from. I asked why we couldn't use the room we arrived in, and Nettie explained there were two for safety reasons. One to arrive in and one to leave from. Apparently, someone arrived while someone else was trying to leave at the same time, and that caused a mess big enough to change the system. That meant we would have to go through the entire dark plane to get to the room to leave. Nettie was given one last pat on the head before we set off. Somehow, I felt as if Sorty was convinced we weren't going to make it. He was proud of Nettie for doing his job, and at the same time regretted it. I considered just staying. It wasn't as if I had much going on in my life that I needed to risk someone else's for. Then again, Nettie wouldn't die. He could just be hurt. I was the one who could die up here. If I died, I might end up back on the plane, so both outcomes were the same. Might as well try to get some of my life back. The door closed behind us, and my stress levels spiked. Nettie wasn't showing how scared he was, aside from his slightly shaking hand as he wrote our next destination. The feeling of the floor becoming a liquid under my feet came and left. I couldn't bring myself to open the door. Nettie took my hand, then the door handle in the other, so we could face whatever was on the other side together. This guy better get a huge raise for all this. The door opened, and the smell hit me first. I nearly doubled over from it. Eyes watering, we took a few steps forwards. My shoe sank almost to the laces in something thick and black. Each step was a chore, and Nettie was having issues with his thin legs. Around us, the plane was covered in black mold spots. Every surface was grimy. This place was already nearly rotten. Thinking we should turn back, I tugged on my hand only for Nettie to look over his shoulder to give me a weak smile. He was strong enough to press on, and it gave me the strength to do the same. With our fingers tightly interlocked, we went through the doorway to start down the long aisle, going across the plane. The passengers were far beyond anything I could ever think of in my worst nightmares. Groaning and clicking came from their seats as we slowly walked by. I tried holding my breath, trying not to be seen by these creatures. Some seats were occupied by nearly rotten away skeletons, while others were taken up by bodies turned to a sludgy mess of black grime. Red eyes peered out, almost glowing. Some raised their hands at us. The movement made the ooze from their bodies slide away from their blackened bones. My stomach turned. I couldn't handle walking through an entire plane of this. Just as we were clearing the first part of the plane and almost reached the small area that separated first class from the rest, a spongy hand landed on my arm. I jumped and muffled a scream. Looking down, I met the red eyes staring back up at me. My mind went blank. In that moment, I'd seen what death truly was. My entire sense of self was drowning in misery and a dark grief. I felt as if I would never recover from it. Unaware of myself, I opened my mouth to scream. Nettie swooped into action, muffling the sound and dragging my struggling body into the small attendance area. I got away from him, slamming into the wall and trying to hide behind the drink cart. He was whispering and trying to shush me as my breathing became so hard. I saw stars. I couldn't do this. I couldn't be there. I wanted to go home to my crappy car and my dead-end job. If I couldn't go there, I would rather die than stay on a plane like this. Just before I sank too deep into that awful feeling and lost myself completely, Nettie pulled me out of it. A warm feeling started in my chest as the frantic panic started to fade. My breathing returned to normal and my sight came back. The flight attendant ran a hand through my hair, whispering encouraging words. If I wasn't with him, I wouldn't have been able to make it this far. When I calmed down a little, he gave me a nervous smile, glad to see I was doing slightly better. Movement behind him made my eyes go wide as I choked out a warning. Turning his head, he looked over at the dark figure that shambled into the room behind him. It was black like the rest of the plane. Red glowing eyes stared at us through dripping feathers. The long thin legs gave it the appearance of a flight attendant. Nettie shot up to face the creature as I stayed on the ground, body shaking from fear. Instead of trying to get away from it, Nettie took a few steps closer. "Seti, is this where you ended up?" he said, in a small, distraught voice I almost couldn't hear. Hearing the noise, the creatures lashed out. It clamped down a set of jaws filled with pointed teeth into Nettie's shoulders. He still refused to move. As the thing clawed at him, he wrapped his arms around the rotting thing. He then did the same thing that he did with me. He talked to the creature in a gentle voice, trying to calm it down. From the sounds of things, they knew each other from a long time ago. I never expected it to work. Slowly, the attacks lessened until the dark arms hung at its side. Lifting the set of teeth from Nettie's bleeding shoulder, the red eyes looked blankly at him. It was impossible to tell what the creature was feeling. "Go." The voice was low and so hoarse it sounded like an inhale. Seti had regained their mind, but only for a short while. The flight attendant could snap again at any moment. Giving his friend one last hug, Nettie took out my outstretched hand. I could see the tears in his eyes, and they weren't from the wounds he received. We pressed on to the next part of the plane, desperate to get out before something else happened. We walked quickly, with all those eyes staring directly at it. Nettie's hand trembled in mine. That crushing dark feeling was coming back. I could feel so many stars on my back. A cold sweat broke out all over my body, and my breathing once again grew uneven. A sound came, and I looked over to see what caused it. One of the passengers stood up. Body mostly stays together. A few rows away, it slipped into the aisle. That caused others to get the same idea. Our pace quickened to as fast as we could walk through the sludge on the floor. Seti was following behind us, red glowing eyes unreadable. With only a few rows to freedom, a hand reached out to grab mine. I tried with all my might to pull away to find it stuck. Nettie's eyes widened and a scream started in his throat. I was going to be pulled into the forming horde. I pulled again, trying to get free, when I was saved by someone I didn't expect. Seti reached out and snapped the arm holding my own. Using his free hand, he tore into his own face, long gashes freely bleeding. The sight and smell driving those creatures wild. It was my turn to save Nettie. He screamed, trying to get to his friend. I easily picked the light flight attendant off his feet and dragged him away with one arm around his waist. So many dark rooms piled into Seti, tearing and biting at the poor thing. For a few seconds, I could see his face looking over at us. I thought there was a hint of a smile through all that rot. He was completely covered by creatures pulling him apart. More came swarming towards us. I got inside the small room with Nettie, slamming the door shut just as bodies thudded on the other side, trying to get in. For a second, Nettie was going to open the door to try and save Seti. I swiftly locked it and pulled him into a tight hug, trying to calm him down like he did with me. In that dim room, I held his frail body as we listened to those creatures pound on the door. His eyes wet and his body shaking from stress. I couldn't help anyone, he choked out. I dared to run my hand through his feathers once before resting my palm on his cheek. Silver eyes wet, he looked up at me, appearing so different from the person I met earlier. I wanted to blame myself for everything, for forcing him to go through all this. Taking a deep breath to ground myself, I shook my head. You helped me. We're almost there. We can do this. I know we can. Once I get home, you'll be able to go back and save Seti with more help, right? A thin smile appeared at my suggestion. Until he could get back to this plane with someone to help out, Seti was going to be torn apart again and again. He couldn't die after all. That fact was almost too much to stomach. We needed to get going so Nettie could focus on saving another person. He looked calmer, even with the noise of the passengers behind us. Moving his head down, he silently signalled that he wanted one more head pat before we carried on. I ruffled his feathers for good luck. Going over to the book set inside the wall, he wrote the location of the next and hopefully last plane. The sounds faded as we jumped to the plane that should have a way to get me back to the land of the living. My hand gripped tightly in his. I saw the pilot's feather fade into dust. How are you going to get back? I asked, shocked. I hadn't thought of this before. I'll get a feather from the pilot here. After you get home, there won't be a rush for one. He answered back, his voice not as cheery as it once was. My stomach knotted up. That could take forever. And we didn't know what we would face on this plane. Would it be the same as the dark one we were in before? I couldn't bring myself to mention any of this. I just let him lead me out of the room and into a very noisy, dimly lit plane. I couldn't hear myself think over the roar of the engines. We were on a military plane, a small one with 6 men strapped to their seats, dressed in full gear. They had their heads down and eyes closed. I saw a closed steel door and my insides were doing flip-flops, thinking I would soon need to jump out of that. Before Nettie did anything, he took out a small notebook from me. He wrote down something quickly on a piece of paper, folded it in half, and sealed it with a gold star sticker. I went to take the note, but he shoved it in my pants pocket, showing it was meant for later. I was glad my work uniform had pockets that zipped up, or else I would risk losing that note. Then, he went over to the end of the seats looking for what we needed. I didn't think it would be so easy, but he grabbed something I thought was a backpack at first. As if he had practiced this, Nettie helped me get the parachute on. He didn't want to risk speaking and waking up the men, so he made notes on how to use the parachute and when to pull it open. I was scared to death. At least if I died from the jump, I might see Nettie again. I was not at all ready to leave, but our hands were forced. One of the men raised his head. Red eyes landed on us. I'd hoped they weren't the same as the ones on the dark plane, but was proven wrong. The plane didn't show signs of rot, but the men did. Two others raised their heads and Nettie shoved me towards the door. His arm was caught, and the two who weren't strapped in reached for him. I looked around for a weapon and grabbed a rifle from one still sleeping soldier. I used it as a baseball bat in the small space. The gun was rusted and useless for anything else. We broke free, my mind unable to keep up with everything going on. A rush of air came as Nettie got the door open, just as hands wrapped around his neck from behind. He fought through the hands, grabbing for him. He took a hold of the front of my shirt, and with a strength I didn't know he had, he pushed me towards the door. I screamed when the only thing keeping me in the plane was Nettie's grip. I grabbed at his arm, begging him to let me back in. The soldier was tearing at his feathers and exposed skin. Deep cuts appeared from their broken nails, and yet Nettie only smiled at me. I couldn't leave him behind. It would be the same situation as Seti. They would overpower him and kill him over and over again. My pleas went completely ignored. With one last bright smile, Nettie dropped me out of the plane. I don't remember the fall or pulling the cord. The earliest memory after dropping out of the plane while reaching out for my friend was waking up in a hospital in a completely different country. I'd been missing for a month before I was found in Scotland of all places, hanging from a parachute tangled in a tree. It had malfunctioned and everyone thought it was a miracle I was alive. No one could figure out how I got into the country or what I was doing being dropped out of a plane. I wasn't offering any answers, and considering the damage, people believed that I didn't remember what happened. Since my parents were well off, not really rich but doing alright, the police thought I was kidnapped for ransom. Why they took me across the sea and dumped me out of a plane was something they would never understand. I hadn't been on the best terms with my parents beforehand, but my mother travelled to help me get home. Flying on a plane so soon after everything happened felt far too strange. It was also a new experience, considering I took the trip on a wheelchair. The fall that should have killed me disfigured my face and took my left leg under the knee. I could be dead, so I wasn't as upset as I thought I would be. Thankfully, they kept the possessions I had on me, including a small note sealed with a golden sticker that proved everything was real. In neat handwriting was a time, date and location set a year after I got out of the hospital. In that year, I got back on my feet, so to speak. The prosthetic leg I was given took some time to adjust to. Some days, I still felt the phantom pain of my missing leg, and I also needed to go into speech classes. My lip had been torn open and scarred. Speaking without a lisp was almost harder than walking again. Or maybe it was all in my head. I also learned how to drive with my new false foot, but didn't do so very often. As the meeting started to get closer, I started to regret not getting plastic surgery for my face. As I drove to the airport, I kept touching my torn lip, wondering if the one I was going to meet would turn heel and leave after seeing how my face looked now. I anxiously waited inside the airport, where the small note said. I've read those words hundreds of times over the year, and yet I still triple-checked to ensure I was in the right spot. Looking up from the worn piece of paper, I spotted someone I thought I would never see again. His face lit up when our eyes met across the room. He took off in a run towards me, ducking between people and a duffel bag slamming against his back. I knew you were alive, he yelled excitedly. I gladly scooped him in for a hug, almost not believing I was seeing Nettie on the ground. He was looking more human than before. His hair was so blonde, it was practically white. It was fluffy and styled as if he walked out of the 80s, but it suited him. His silver grey areas were sparkling and his face was flushed, showing off freckles across his cheeks. I'm so happy to see you're safe, I could kiss you. The words slipped out, and I regretted them, even before I finished speaking. I wouldn't mind, Nettie answered with a small laugh. When he realised what he agreed to, a muffled scream came from his throat, and I thought I could see his soul leave his body. Face pale with embarrassment, he was too mortified to explain himself. He didn't need to. Ducking down, I did exactly what I promised. A shocked chirp coming from him and his hair puffing out into feathers for half a second. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have. I started feeling a bit embarrassed as well. No, it's fine. I just never. He started shaking his head. We both heard a whistle from the crowd that paused to give our scene a look. We did appear to be a long separated couple meeting again. It made us both laugh and ease the tension. What are you doing here? I mean, on the ground. And are you all right? Nettie nodded, pulling away but still keeping my hand in his. It took a while, but I got away and back to my own plane. When the higher-ups heard about what happened, they threatened to fire me. I've never taken any vacation time and had so much piled up. I decided to do that before they came to a decision about my job. We also were able to save SETI. Passengers attacking an attendant is unforgivable, so he was removed from the plane and is recovering with Bodhi. That was a lot to take in. If he was fired, then what? At least some good came out of this whole mess though. I could hang out with him until his few weeks of vacation were over and SETI had got out of that awful plane. How long do you have? Like 3 weeks? 4 weeks, I asked. 30 years. His answer nearly made me choke. How long was Nettie flying for to accumulate that much time? It was a question I didn't think I really wanted to know the answer to. I'll be working as a flight attendant here. Only part-time, but it's something. I just landed, so I need to find a place to stay while I'm on the ground. I have some money, but not much, until I start working again. Would you like to stay with me? I said without a second thought. His eyes got even brighter, and his face flushed all the way to the tips of his ears. He had hoped I would offer, but would never bring himself to ask. With the cutest smile in the world, he clutched my hands together. That would be, for a second before he stopped lost for words. Terrific, I finished. His laughter was the best sound in the world. As we walked out, I filled him in about the year we spent apart. A thought popped in the back of my mind, that he had only taken 30 years because I might only be around for that long. After that, we might be together again on that plane of his if he didn't get fired. I doubted they would let him go. He was only doing his best for a passenger after all. I wondered if he did get fired and what would happen to me after I died. Would I rot like the others? I knew no matter what, I was no longer going anywhere in my life or my death without Nettie by my side. Last week, my wife had minor surgery. I own a motorbike and I drove her to the hospital for check-in. The surgery took 30 minutes and the doc said we could leave after 6 hours of observation. By the time of discharge, it was already around 2:30 a.m. I don't feel confident driving at night, and I was pretty nervous to drive the bike with my recently operated wife. So, I called her a cab and sent her home, and I took the bike home. There are 3 routes to get home. The easier and adequately lit route was closed due to road maintenance. The longer route, which will almost take twice as much time to reach home, and the shorter route, which is a narrow road with minimal lighting and less traffic. My favourite route as I commute to work every day. I was exhausted and was already nervous about riding at night. Keep in mind that my nervousness had nothing to do with paranormal stuff. It's more of a vision issue and my past driving experiences at night. I picked the shorter route as I'm most familiar with this route, and I even came to the hospital on the same route. The shit hit the fan when I'm halfway through the route. I felt sudden chills with goosebumps and my heart rate elevated. I was almost certain I wasn't alone. I couldn't see a single vehicle in the last 20 minutes. The night swallowed every possible sound except for my motorbike. I was checking my side mirrors again and again to see if there was any other vehicles in either way. Suddenly, I saw a figure sitting backward in my pillion seat. My heart nearly stopped. I blinked and it was gone. A few minutes later, there it was again, with long curly hair and a dark shirt. I couldn't make out if it was a guy or a girl. I blinked and it was gone. I didn't see it anymore throughout the journey. I reached a traffic stop and puked my heart out. Finally, I can see vehicles. I'm almost home. I was shaking and had an unexplainable fear. Told my wife the whole thing. The next morning, as usual, I took the same route to work. I kept checking the spot where I saw that figure on my pillion seat. I kept checking my side mirrors and never saw that figure. I often drink chai from a stall on that route. I told the owner about the experience. I've known him for a long time. He said a couple of days back, someone died in that spot. The guy was talking on the phone on his bike, parked on the side. A mini truck at high speed hit him and he died on the spot. He had the same motorbike as mine, even the same colour. I've experienced paranormal activity ever since I could remember. Because of this, I've never really been afraid of it. Actually, I've always been very interested in it. One of the scariest experiences I've ever happened over a long period of time. I was around the ages of 3 to 7. Every night, around midnight, my grandmother would fly up to my window that was on the 3rd story. She would continuously knock on the window until I would eventually wake up and go over to her, and she would tell me to go to the woods. Keep in mind, my house was surrounded by thick woods all the way around. These woods always gave off a really sickening vibe. Side story, but my parents would always send me out to play in the backyard by myself. I had such a bad feeling about the woods that I would always sneak back inside because I didn't feel safe outside alone. One time, my parents locked all the doors to get into the house because I kept sneaking inside after they sent me out. I stood in between the door and the frame of the door, crying and begging them to let me in. I was a very adventurous kid, and I would do anything to explore, and I wasn't afraid of being alone outside at anybody else's house. Anyways, she would often put some kind of odd explanation behind it, like, "I'm going to take you shopping if you get in my car, follow me to the woods." Somehow, I knew it wasn't her. She just didn't give off the same energy as she normally did. However, I would still wake my parents up and ask them if I could go into the woods with my grandmother. I know it wasn't a recurring dream because it would happen to not only my little sister, but my mother as well. It got to a point where my parents had to board up my window so I wouldn't eventually jump out of my window and die. My grandmother wasn't the only thing that this creature would take the form of. Around the time that my parents boarded up my window, there was a little girl with beautiful blue eyes and wavy blonde hair. She would always skip into my room with a pink Victorian dress and white tights that appeared to glow. She would also tell me to go into the woods, once again having a weird explanation behind it. The one I remember the clearest was, "My nana has some toys for you to play with, but she'll only give to them if you go into the woods." These experiences stopped as I moved out of that house. Recently, I heard about a creature known as a skinwalker. It sounds very similar to this. However, I'm pretty sure a skinwalker can only change into animals, so it's still unclear. I still wonder what would have happened to me if I had gone out into the woods.